What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, we are going to be talking about my updated top 10 rookie wide receiver rankings after the NFL Combine. So if you guys still are trying to get a feel for this wide receiver class, learn some things about these wide receivers, this is the video for you. Let's not waste any more time. Let's hop right into today's video and let's start talking about my first wide receiver. Now, coming in at my wide receiver 10, we are going to be talking about Xavier Legette out of South Carolina. And this is a guy who tested really well at the NFL Combine. People are calling him a mini DK Metcalf. He really wins at that contested catch. And he really does this well, especially when he's one-on-one with a corner. I think he's a wide receiver that kind of has that boom-bust type of potential. It's similar to the Jonathan Mingos of years past. And I know that that name's not necessarily the best name. It doesn't get everybody very excited, but it is that type of wide receiver that I think Xavier Legette is. I do have some concerns with Legette because he didn't necessarily perform or really produce a lot early on in his collegiate career. But like I said, I think he is a good deep threat, has very strong hands, and I think he does a good job with the timing of his catch. He shows his hands late, and it does help create better passing windows for the quarterback of his team. But with that said, Xavier Legette comes in as my wide receiver 10. But moving on over to my wide receiver 9, that's where I have Keon Coleman, wide receiver out of Florida State. And Keon Coleman, he started at Michigan State, ended up transferring over to Florida State here in 2023. And when you throw the highlights on, when you throw the tape on, this is a guy who literally jumps out of the gym. He plays above the rim, a very athletic wide receiver. He has that prototypical size, that prototypical strength that we want to see out of those X-type wide receivers at the NFL level. And he does a really good job of high pointing the football. I think he has very strong hands that give him the ability to create those true highlight worthy plays. He does lack some of the route running chops that I like to see in some of my wide receivers, especially for fantasy football. And he did give us a pretty lackluster 40-yard dash at the NFL Combine. I think because of that, it's probably going to put him closer to a second-round wide receiver talent in the NFL draft compared to when he was being valued as a first-round wide receiver before. But all in all, Keon Coleman comes in as my wide receiver 9, and that takes us to my wide receiver 8, which is going to be Xavier Worthy, wide receiver out of Texas. Now, as I'm sure you guys are all aware, Xavier Worthy absolutely killed the NFL Combine. He set a historic performance in the 40-yard dash. The speed is undeniable. 4.21 was the 40-yard time. And not only that, he's also explosive as hell. He had a 41-inch vertical and a 10-foot, 11-inch broad jump. And I would say on tape, he's not necessarily the most consistent wide receiver with his hands. And I will say I don't necessarily think he is going to profile or project to be a number one wide receiver for an NFL team, but he does play with some elusiveness and some creativity after the catch that I do think is going to excite NFL GMs. I think he's stronger after the catch as well, probably stronger than people would think with the weight that he weighed in at. Obviously, that weight could be an issue for him. It is pretty light. It's 165 pounds is the official weight, but analytically, Xavier Worthy checks all of those boxes. He has the early breakout age that we want. He has some of the other statistics that we look for. And I think based off of his combine performance and some of the early production that we saw out of Xavier Worthy at Texas, this is a guy that is most likely going to find himself in the first round or the early second round of the NFL draft. And that is probably going to put him in some favorable scenarios for wide receiver landing spots. If he gets a landing spot like Kansas City, I think people are going to go crazy. But Xavier Worthy, currently my wide receiver 8 in my rookie rankings. Now moving on to my wide receiver 7, that's where we have McConkey, wide receiver out of Georgia. And McConkey wasn't necessarily the most highly recruited prospect coming out of high school. And really, if you were just looking at box scores, you probably wouldn't be impressed with his 2023 season. However, injuries did derail most of this year for McConkey. He battled a back injury, some ankle injuries, some things like that. But when you throw on the tape and you see what he does here for the Georgia Bulldogs, this is a guy who is a crisp route runner, and I do think that he plays with enough speed to keep DBs honest, keep them guessing here at the next level. He tested better athletically than I think anybody expected him to test at the Combine. He ran a 4.39 40, had a 36-inch vertical, so I do think that that probably boosted his draft stock here for the NFL draft, and I think this is a guy who is a pro-ready player. I think he's going to be able to contribute to an NFL roster day one as soon as he steps into the building. And when you ask McConkey who he compares his game to, he uses names like Cooper Kupp, Justin Jefferson, Devontae Adams. These are the guys he looks up to. I think it shows up on the tape, especially in his route running. He seems to take it pretty seriously, and I do think it shows on tape. So McConkey showing up as my wide receiver 7 here in my rookie rankings, and that takes us over to my wide receiver 6, who's going to be Troy Franklin, wide receiver out of Oregon. Now, early on in my process, process, Troy Franklin is a guy who I fell in love with the tape pretty early. He's a guy who plays very fast. He's super shifty when he has the ball in his hands. I think he's very excellent at the release point when he's running his routes. And with that being said, I think he's a crafty route runner. This is a guy who wins and separates enough that I think he's going to find success at the next level. He has a great feel for the defense, and I think he attacks the open spaces really well in those zones. That's really where I think he does his most damage, is against zone coverage. But don't let that fool you. He's also good enough with man, and that's because of the quickness that I talked about before. I think this is a guy who is probably going to fit in as a number 2 wide receiver for an NFL team, and I think wherever he lands, no matter the landing spot, he is going to instantly improve the team that he's drafted to, especially when it comes to attacking downfield. That's where Troy Franklin excels. And even though I think Troy Franklin lacks a little bit of physicality, it shows up, especially in press coverage at times. I do think this is a very well-rounded wide receiver who is going to perform very good at the next level. Now moving on to my wide receiver 5, that is where I have Brian Thomas Jr., wide receiver for the LSU Tigers. And even though Brian Thomas wasn't super productive very early on here at LSU, this is a guy who did finish number 3 all-time in touchdowns, and he passed up guys like Jamar Chase during his time at LSU in those receiving touchdown categories. And I think this is a guy who's going to be an elite deep threat at the next level. He does have some good short area quickness that shows up on the tape. I think some of the knocks that I've heard for Brian Thomas is he does seem to be a little bit of a body catcher. People say he tries to catch it in the basket rather than using his hands. But all in all, I think he is a very impressive wide receiver, and he did kill the NFL Combine. Ran a 4.33 40, which is faster than I think some people expected, had a 38.5-inch vert, and I think he's almost certainly locked himself in as a top 20 pick in the NFL draft come April, and that is going to make him a highly coveted wide receiver for your rookie drafts, and that's why he's coming in as a top 5 wide receiver for me in this class at my wide receiver 5. And now coming in at my wide receiver 4, that's where I have Adonai Mitchell, wide receiver for the Texas Longhorns. And Adonai Mitchell was a Georgia Bulldog before he transferred over to the Texas Longhorns. This is a guy who is a very good route runner. He has great size, he's good against press coverage, and I do think that he has a very expansive, very big catch radius that shows up on tape. He plucks the football out of the air very well. I think it shows at the contested catch point, and he plays with enough fluidity that I think it looks very good. It gives people some shades of CeeDee Lamb in his game. We've heard some of those comparisons from guys like Brett Coleman in the fantasy football space, and I think he has really good body control. He does enough after the catch that it shows up, especially with his yak. All in all, a very good, very well-rounded wide receiver, and that's why he's coming in as my wide receiver 4 in this class. And let's not forget how good of a combine Adonai Mitchell had as well. And after running a 4.34 40-yard dash, I think he's almost but solidified his draft capital as a first-round wide receiver in the NFL draft. Now coming in at my wide receiver 3, there are no surprises. My top 3 are pretty much the same as everybody this year who is evaluating wide receiver talent. I have Rome Odunze, wide receiver for the Washington Huskies, here as my wide receiver 3. This is an athletic wide receiver who has great, strong hands, very strong hands. He has true alpha X-type wide receiver size, and that gives him a lot of upside because he also is a very athletic profile, finishing with 92 receptions for 1,639 yards and 13 touchdowns in 2023, in a year where he got to compete for a national championship. Odunze really didn't drop the football. He put very minimal drops on tape. He separates well for his size, and like I mentioned, great at the contested catch. There's really not too much to dislike about Rome Odunze's game, and I think for most people he is going to be coming in as the wide receiver 3 in this class, and that's where he sits in my rankings. And that takes us on to my wide receiver 2, that is going to be Malik Nabers, wide receiver out of LSU. Now for me, Malik Nabers is the clear wide receiver 2 in this class. I have all 3 of these guys. You know who the number 1 wide receiver is. I have all of them tiered in their own tiers, but I do think they all separate themselves from one another. And what we like about Malik Nabers is he is great after the catch. He has really good acceleration that he plays with. I think he can dominate at all 3 levels as a professional wide receiver. And when you look at where he was lining up in college football, he played both outside and in the slot, so that's going to bode well for him at the NFL level. The breakout age is exactly what you want to see, a very young breakout age. And when we're talking about elite 2023 seasons, this is a guy who had 89 catches for 1,568 yards and 14 touchdowns. And like I said, that's why he comes in for me as the clear wide receiver 2. And that's going to take us to our wide receiver 1 in this class. You know the name. Marvin Harrison Jr., wide receiver out of Ohio State. And there's really not too much we need to say about Marvin Harrison Jr. you guys know the deal. A very elite prospect, a guy who has probably locked himself into top 5 draft capital in the NFL draft. He's being valued already as a top 5 wide receiver in Dynasty Fantasy Football, just below the guys like Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, CeeDee Lamb, and Amon-Ra St. Brown. And like I said, elite on all levels, a guy that really showed up on the tape. You see, he's a truly special prospect. Sudden in and out of the breaks, has lots of production at a very high volume in college, has great body control, and all in all, yes, he is the son of Marvin Harrison. Well, he looks like it. He has the pedigree. This is everybody's #1 wide receiver, or at least should be everyone's #1 wide receiver in this class, and that's where he sits for me today. So just to recap my top 10 wide receivers for you guys, it is going to be #1, Marvin Harrison Jr., #2, Malik Nabers, 3, Rome Odunze, 4, Adonai Mitchell, 5, Brian Thomas Jr., 6, Troy Franklin, 7, Lad McConkey, 8, Xavier Worthy, 9, Keon Coleman, and 10, Xavier Legette. So if you guys like this video, you felt like you got some content today that was both actionable and entertaining, go ahead and do me a favor, hit that like button. It is the best free way to show our channel some support. Also, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel. That way you never miss any future uploads. And make sure you're hitting that notification bell as well. And the last and final piece for you guys, go join my Discord. There is a free Discord linked in the description, helping you guys out with your Dynasty Fantasy Football teams as we prepare for the 2024 season. So make sure you guys are signed up for that Discord. Like I said, it's free to join, so there is no risk in doing that. But with all of those things out of the way, I will see you guys on our next video. But until then, peace out.